Fred Richani of TSC News, the Sports Courier Podcast. We have right here on the line a very special guest. I'm honored to have on the legendary Dave Meltzer, legendary journalist, entrepreneur, one of the most authorities on combat sports and combat sports business. Dave, how's everything going?
It's going. I mean, it's 2020. You know how that goes.
Yeah, man.
It's not been a stellar year.
Oh yeah, definitely not. Now, you're kind of uniquely qualified to sort of talk about this because you've run the Wrestling Observer for years and years, decades now. So you're used to working from home, but obviously this is under some different circumstances with the pandemic. How much has the pandemic changed the way you do business and how you work with sources?
It really hasn't at all because I was working from home anyway. So, it's changed what I do. Before it was, I would go to shows, I would travel, which I don't do. So that's changed, and I would meet with a lot of people, and I don't really meet with hardly anyone. But as far as, it's changed. My coverage used to be like covering matches, and obviously I still cover the TV matches, but there's a lot more coverage on, social issues, honest to God, because that's been like at the forefront, and it does affect pro wrestling and combat sports. I think, It's been, and I think I spend more time. I've spent more time on the Observer for sure than I had in a long, long time, just because of there's still a lack of other things to do, and also because, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, I just thought it was kind of like my job to learn. I've spent a lot of time, talking to doctors and things. A lot of stuff that happened this year that I felt I needed to learn about, and so it relates to wrestling because you've got wrestling companies that kept going, and WWE had an outbreak because they were they really didn't handle it very well, and then some other it's interesting to watch all the different companies and how everyone handles it differently, and you kind of see. I think I noticed as soon as the pandemic started, I thought that what was going to happen, not just in combat sports but in life in general and in politics and everything. We were going to see the good people shine and the bad people were going to really stand out. And I think that it happened way worse than I expected, or way more exaggerated than I expected, but it certainly happened that way.
For sure. And if I told you at the beginning of the year that, hey, there's going to be a huge pandemic and Vince McMahon is going to handle it horrifically in comparison to Dana White, what would you have told me?
I wouldn't have been surprised, honestly. But at the beginning of the pandemic, like if you were talking about the first couple weeks of the pandemic, yeah, that would have surprised me because Dana White was really in a denial phase. But as soon as he figured out it was real, he turned it around. And he's actually done he's done a phenomenal job. He said some really stupid things at first, but he's done a phenomenal job. And I think Vince has done a much better job since they had the outbreak. But overall, I think WWE in so many ways has handled it from an ethical, moral, and health standpoint, worse than anyone, and they have the resources not to be that company, but they were.
Do you think that WWE's recent downtrend in the ratings, other than the pandemic with a lot of shows down, do you think it has anything to do with their, lack of a positive stance towards social issues and public health issues, or is it just the fact that, quite frankly, a lot of people don't find the product interesting right now?
I think it's all the product. The lack of fans certainly hurts, but I also find, which makes, pro wrestling without fans is a lot less exciting. So that hurts. But also, the creative and the booking is atrocious right now. It's probably the worst in the history of the company. So that hurts a lot too. I used to, when people would go, oh, it's like this is worse than like WCW in like 1999. It's like, and it's still not. And it's like, no, nothing's worse than WCW. Then they were so out of touch. But this group, it's like I wouldn't say that they're out of touch, but they don't have their finger on the pulse. It's not like completely out of touch. It's just kind of like they don't get the public and they don't get the new fans and things like that, and it shows.
It definitely does. And you did a phenomenal deep dive a couple of weeks ago in the Wrestling Observer newsletter with this ratings breakdown and WWE's downturn, and we were talking off the air about how you even learned a lot just doing it in the process. Not to give too much away from it, it's not subscribed, but from what I gathered, WWE's definitely going in the wrong direction, and AEW continues to be a phenomenal value for TNT. Is that so?
Compared to WWE and Fox and NBC Universal, they're a phenomenal value for sure, yeah. What surprised me, I just figured that everything would be down, and I was more looking, I went so deep in the demographics because I was trying to figure out, like, who's down where, and I certainly got my answers, but it was interesting because of how much, like, AEW and Raw and SmackDown were all down with over 50, about the same. So over 50, it's just kind of like, it was like 18-19%. But when you get under 50, and especially under 35, all of a sudden it's like things change completely. NXT held its own with over 50. They're the only ones, maybe because they're the most conservative style wrestling or older style wrestling. I don't know. AEW has done phenomenal, 18 to 34 in particular, just phenomenal, especially with women. Just added, they're actually beating Raw and SmackDown in women 18 to 34, which makes absolutely no sense. And last week, actually, in overall 18 to 34, they won. But they're gaining, whereas these other companies are losing. So it's been, it isn't so much that AEW's gained a lot, but they haven't fallen during the pandemic much at all. And I think that's because they're in touch with their audience, and WWE is not in touch with their audience, and they've fallen an incredible amount. If you look at 18 to 34s, they're down like 40%. 18 to 49, I think was 18 to 49. Raw was down like 35.5, and SmackDown was down close to 38%. I mean, it's like that's in 5 months, and it's kind of like that's a drop. That's a really staggering drop. And of course, the pandemic is a big part of it, but not all of it. A lot of that drop because the other shows didn't drop nearly as much. Impact didn't drop as much. That tells you that it's it's the product they're presenting. That's in the end, that's when you drop like that, that's culprit number one.
In retrospect, do you think it would have been better for WWE, knowing what we all know now, for them to have run archive programming after WrestleMania, at least for a little while, maybe kind of be like New Japan, where they just air old matches on New Japan World, as opposed to coming back right away, especially with all the health concerns? Because if you look at it, and I could be wrong here, but it's hard to believe they could go lower than this if they were airing, old Rock and Stone Cold matches.
Yeah, they could have done it, and I remember talking to Tony Khan about the same thing. Obviously they don't have the kind of library where they could do it for very long. WWE has an endless library; they could do it forever. I think that what would have, I think that we've seen with other sports, kind of like there's absence that makes the heart grow fonder, and WWE certainly has not done that. But they were afraid of losing those TV deals because economically those TV deals are carrying them, and the companies that are signing the checks may be looking at ways to get out of that expense because the ratings were not what those companies envisioned. So I think Vince felt the pressure to do everything he could to fulfill the TV deals. Originally he was going to keep going live rather than tape because he was afraid of losing the deals because the contracts called for a certain number of live dates. But the companies, Fox and NBCU, pretty much told him, look, it's a pandemic, you don't have to go live. So then they started taping 2 shows at once and cut back on expenses. But the TV hasn't been good.
It hasn't really been good at all. And we know, I think, what WWE can do long-term to make things better. I mean, obviously, book with logic, have some clean finishes, have some good storytelling, don't dive into stupid tropes and things we've seen in the past that have turned off fans. But, right now, I mean, they're in a pretty damn deep hole. If there was one major thing you would want them to do or that they should do that could maybe not turn things around, but at least start helping them trend upwards again, what would it be?
Stop giving wrestlers scripts for interviews would be way up on the list. Every wrestler says this. They don't listen. There was another one. It would be make your finishes mean something, and don't do finishes like it's the 1980s where you just do it because you got to figure out a way to get out of a match. Use your finish to build to the next thing, to be part of the storyline. Because when the finishes don't count and they're just like easy, cheap finishes, nobody cares about the product. And you can have people, you don't want people to not care, and you don't want people to be mad at the wrong things, mad at the company, as opposed to, of course it's okay to be mad at the villains, but you get people mad at the company way too much.
Yeah, and it's just, it's crazy. They had a Twitter thread a few weeks ago where they talked about inter-brand dream matches, and it's like Drew McIntyre versus Braun Strowman and this person versus that person. And it just astonished me. Like, there's no dream matches in WWE right now. Whereas even like if you go back like 10, 15 years ago, there was like John Cena versus Jeff Hardy. And if you go back to kind of like the early days of the brand split, of course, they had eventually Kurt Angle versus Shawn Michaels and John Cena versus Triple H. And it's just crazy to think that there's like no match right now in WWE that is that fans are clamoring for right now. At least not like it's like crazy.
Because nobody's like super over, which part of that is the pandemic when you try to build up new people, but they're not stars to the public because the public doesn't see a great crowd reaction to the people because there's no crowd to react. So I think that's a big part of it. And also there's the reliance, especially in the last 2 months, of guys from the past trying to, hotshot a 1 week rating. I mean, they're even doing this Monday with Raw with Shawn Michaels. And it's like, yeah, you can do it, but you're just, honestly, you dig yourself into more of a hole when you do that because you just, one of the big problems is that it's a very aging company. They don't have a lot of guys in their 20s or women. They have more women in their 20s probably, but they don't have a lot of guys in their 20s on the main roster. And that's what they need is like new, like 23-year-old stars. And the way they do their system, they just don't do that.
It's crazy to think about, right? I don't feel like UFC's doing anything totally different when it comes to their presentation, but I feel like maybe because they were the first, like, quote-unquote, real sport to be back in the swing of things, at least domestically here. I mean, they've been killing it. They've been doing pretty well with TV ratings. Of course, buy rates have been awesome, especially by ESPN Plus standards, with them getting a huge cut. I mean, is it as simple as, theaters are closed, sports fans need something to watch, UFC's always been great action, and it's just a great combination, and that's why they're doing well? Or is there something that maybe the average viewer, the average fan, isn't noticing that UFC's doing that's significantly better than, say, WWE right now?
I think UFC didn't devalue its pay-per-views. Even though not all of them were good, they always, had matches that felt important. And they hyped the matches, and they hyped the athletes as opposed to hype the brand. Even though UFC's a lot on the brand, it's really hyping the stars. They made stars. I mean, the key to selling pay-per-views is stars, and stars fighting each other. And they've had some really good matches, and they've had, I think Tony Ferguson kind of became a star. Khabib Nurmagomedov definitely became a star. Conor McGregor's a big star, even though they haven't had him fight during the pandemic. Masvidal became a big star. I think a lot of that has to do with ESPN also. WWE talent really isn't going to be on ESPN a lot because they're not sports. And UFC, with their partnership with ESPN, these guys are now all over ESPN, and they become far more recognized, and then you get people interested in your big fights. I think that going away helped too. I think that when they went away and came back, they did that great buy rate for Ferguson and Gaethje that they never would have done if they kept running. So I think going away was a big help, whereas when WWE and even AEW didn't go away at all, you don't have the big comeback, you don't have the want and missing them. You know what I mean? Kind of like what's happened to a degree with the NBA as well, and NHL. So I think that's a lot of it. Just they didn't go away and everybody else went away.
Now, this has been absolutely a crazy year in so many respects, and especially in professional wrestling. Now, I've interviewed your colleague, your business partner, your co-host, Bryan Alvarez, a few times on the show. He once had a great line where he said, if you cover pro wrestling all the time, you go a little crazy, and he credited doing jiu-jitsu and doing some other things to kind of keep him sane. So with everything that's been going on here and you having to kind of stay home more often than not due to the pandemic, how have you been able to stay sane in the midst of the outbreak within WWE, the speaking out movement and all the allegations, all the rating stuff, all the usual backstage drama that you keep up with? How has Dave Meltzer stayed level-headed in 2020?
I'm forced to because I don't have time not to go crazy because I always have to cover something. It never ends. I think that's part of it. The one thing that was really good for me was certainly covering UFC at the same time as wrestling, because when you cover UFC, you know, and it has become less in the last couple of years. Wrestling has really grown up a lot, but for a long time it was like, you know, when you cover UFC, you really see how whacked out wrestling can be sometimes. But really, like, I think that the wrestling has, you know, the wrestling business has I don't know if the word's cleaned up, but, you know, even with the speaking out stuff, you know, it's like the business that I grew up with when it comes to that kind of stuff was a million times worse than this business. Even though you didn't hear about it, it was. But it's really not that bad. Just I think the decision making at the WWE is pretty heartless in some cases, and not always the best. But I mean, like, the talent involved right now, I think that the mentality of the talent across the board in pro wrestling is the healthiest it's ever been. I mean, before it was like people who were, thinking like con men trying to, con people out of their money. And now the mentality is that we are performers and we're going to give people, the best show that we can. And they do, I mean, these guys try so hard. They work so hard. And they come in all shapes and sizes. They don't have to be all 6'2" and 230 and stuff like that. I mean, it's good if you are, but you don't have to be. It's all about your talent and what you're willing to do and what you have the athletic ability to do.
Obviously, there's been lessons in wrestling, I'm sure you've learned, that don't apply in real life. Things that are like, this would never occur in real life compared to pro wrestling. But is there a life lesson you learned through covering wrestling?
Maybe it helps with politics a little bit, in the sense that the phoniness, and you see the phoniness in politics, kind of helps you see it, I think. No, I mean, the life lessons I've learned in wrestling don't necessarily have to do with wrestling, but have to do with reporting. And those, it wouldn't matter the subject. You would have to still learn those lessons. I mean, I could learn those lessons. I mean, wrestling gives you different kinds of lessons because it's such a different world. I think you get to see, a wide variety of people, because wrestlers certainly are not cookie cutter people, not whatsoever. And I mean, they vary. It's like you have some really honest guys, you have some really dishonest guys. You have ambitious guys. You have people who are not that ambitious. You have people with incredible drive, who sacrifice so much. I think like covering wrestling, you do get kind of, a perspective of a lot of different things.
You had a great perspective, too, learning back in the day from the late, great journalist Frank Deford. For those that don't know, I mean, he was on Real Sports. I mean, he ran a number of publications. I mean, just an absolutely legendary writer, a guy who gave his full endorsement to you. Looking back, how fortunate do you feel to learn from him? Not forget wrestling, just when it comes to journalism and life.
What a lucky break that was. It's so funny because it was like, when I was like a kid, like 10, 11 years old, he was my favorite writer. So the idea that I was able to work with him for, a year and a half so closely was like a dream come true. I mean, I remember like when he called me up when he was starting the National to do it, it was almost like I don't know how to. It was so weird because when I took the call, it was like, how did this happen? You know what I mean? It's like this was never going to happen in my life, and there it did. And yeah, learning from him, he was so experienced, and he saw through so much bullshit. And I definitely learned a lot about ethics and things like that, and just discussions. We never talked wrestling, although we sometimes talked Vince McMahon. But we didn't really talk wrestling because he wasn't really a wrestling fan. But we would talk, boxing. I remember he was, and it didn't happen yet. But I remember him telling me, like, you're gonna get to a certain age, and you're gonna hate boxing. I remember him telling me that because he hated boxing, and I didn't get to where I hated boxing. But I remember him telling me, he was like a big boxing fan, and then he reached a certain age, and he absolutely hated boxing because of the human loss, lives lost, things like that, deaths in the ring, and the fact that in the end, like the fighters, some of them make it, but most of them don't, and it chews you up and spits you out, and you get brain damage and the whole bit. He really was not a fan of how boxing was, and I remember, but he had a wide variety of interests. I mean, a lot of sports people, it's baseball, football, hockey, basketball. I mean, he was like me, where we both had in common is we were into if it was beach volleyball or roller derby or whatever. It was like that stuff fascinated us, the offbeat sports. So it was the luckiest break for sure. It's probably the luckiest break of my career. The other one was early on when some of the wrestlers started talking to me, and luckily I got really smart ones talking to me, and some of the promoters and kind of teaching me, the methods of promoting, which was really good because, they kind of taught me to see through the BS of other promoters. I was really lucky at for both of those things.
When did you realize that the Wrestling Observer newsletter could become a business and your career?
When I first started it, I thought that the potential was there, but I didn't really expect it. I guess in 86, 87, when I was making no money on it, and I was working so hard as a sports writer, and I kind of had to make the choice, and my parents and everybody just thought, well, you got to keep the wrestling thing and go into sports writing, and I chose the other one, and everyone was like, you chose the one with no future. But I felt like that wrestling was undercovered, and I could feel a better, like there's always going to be some people covering sports, but I didn't think wrestling had that, so I thought that I could be of more benefit on wrestling. And also, by that time, it was like, even though I wasn't making any money doing wrestling, I was more famous doing wrestling than I was doing, high school sports or, whatever, soccer or whatever. So it kind of like led me there. And then, after I kind of made that call and I wrote, I did the Who's Who book, which did start making money. And then the National came. And then that was like, when I started writing for the National, that's when it really turned around, those 2 years, because I was in a big daily paper and my name got big and I got a lot of new subscribers. I mean, really, my subscriptions, I don't remember what it was, but, it went from a very modest number and probably doubled, or tripled during that 2-year period.
Wow.
And from that point on, I've been able to make a good living out of it. So the National was huge. That period was a great period of growth, just by having the exposure in the National every week.
I've interviewed a lot of entrepreneurs, and the recurring theme that they tell me in their stories is they're always worried that one day they wake up and everything's just gone. Everything they worked for, everything they built, and they always feel like they have to keep refining, keep trying new things. Obviously, stay consistent with what's working. What does Dave Meltzer do in order to not only stay consistent, but to make sure that this keeps going and growing and growing as you get older?
Pray. I'm at the mercy of the business, unfortunately. And really, the top company kind of determines your, I would like, like a big wrestling war would be really cool. And we have one. I think that's been interesting. But we've been lucky in the sense of, I think we got into the podcasting thing at the bottom, at the ground floor. And so by the time it got big, we were established. So I think that was a real lucky. But it's, the business success, I mean, it's like with Bryan Alvarez, we work really, really hard, like just super hard, and we're super dedicated to our clientele. I mean, literally, we don't miss shows. And I mean, no matter what happens in our personal life, and sometimes we may have to record at 1:30 a.m. Actually, that's more often than you think. But we just don't miss shows. So the hard work is certainly part of it, but it's also, it's understanding what we cover as well, and it's also been a lot of, I think there's been a lot of luck in the sense of the podcasting thing hitting at the right time. The internet changed it. It's made things more competitive, but that's good. But it also has opened up information a lot more, and the ease of contacting people is a lot more. The internet has some horrible qualities, but by and large, I know a lot of people think that it's a negative. I think it's a giant positive, but there is a giant negative to it, horrible negative. But the positive outweighs the negative.
We like to ask all our guests some kind of rapid-fire questions, some random questions, just so fans can get to know them better. Are you ready?
Sure.
What's your favorite cheat meal?
Cheat meal? I don't really like cheat meals too much. Just going out. I would go out to restaurants all the time, but even then I didn't really eat too bad. And now there's not a lot of restaurants. So now, the one thing I'll say is during the pandemic, I've eaten a lot better just because, there's no restaurants to go to. But, I mean, when I go out, it's, a lot of sushi and things like that. That would be like my favorite restaurant meal.
Good choice. Yeah, I can attest to that. Not being in New York City during the pandemic, being holed up in Jersey, it's a lot less tempting not having a Shake Shack around the corner. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's just because I don't have bad food in the house, and I don't leave the house, so it's actually been like the diet's actually been pretty easy. I mean, like, and it's no pressure because it's like you got no choice. I mean, I'll have these days where it's just like I crave something, but it's like I can't have it anyway. I mean, the certain restaurant things, like I've got a Fogo de Chow's right around the corner from my house, but it's not open, so it like even if I crave it, it's like I ain't going.
True. Now, you're somebody that's also known to have worked out rigorously over the years, maintained an awesome physique, especially for your age. And you once famously or infamously, depending on who you ask, said that you have better abs than John Morrison on your radio show.
I did 4 years, 4.5, 5 years ago. I did. I don't anymore. It's age. You can't beat age. And I was amazed at the time. I didn't really do a lot. I mean, when I was young, I trained very, very hard, and my body responded real well to training. I was very lucky. And then, my son was born. It was just kind of like I didn't do anything. And then I did like little bits here and there, essentially just like lift weights during the commercials on Raw. I mean, that's literally what I would do. And then, I started gaining weight, and that wasn't good. And so I started doing long bike rides, which was good. And then I was in Vegas for the Conor McGregor and Chad Mendes match, and that morning I went to the gym. And I usually go to the gym and bike, but I was like, I was going to lift weights at the gym, which I hadn't done in probably 15 years. And I liked it so much, so then I joined the gym. And up until the pandemic, I was doing pretty good as long as I wasn't injured, which happens frequently, or so. But when I was like 56, 57, my body just responded super. I don't even know what happened. It was so easy, and I had better. I wouldn't necessarily say better, but equivalent abs of Johnny Mundo. That was like my big goal. When I'm 60, I'm going to have abs like Johnny Mundo. But by the time I got to 60, it really was a difference. And I guess having any abs at 60 is like a plus, but they're not like him now. No, not even remotely close. It's just
well,
reality.
Well, you know what? I'm glad we cleared all that up. Hey, I'm sure your physique is still rather impressive. Now, we cover football pretty extensively here in TSC. I know you also grew up a football fan. Did you have a favorite football player growing up?
I'm sure I did. Johnny Unitas, Bob Greasy, those type of guys. There's probably others. I remember Johnny Unitas when I was a little kid, though, for sure. Fran Tarkenton, Daryl LaMonica, Joe Namath. Not so much Joe Namath; he was too brash. But I liked Joe Namath because I thought that he was great for football. He was awesome for football. So it's like I wasn't like a big fan of his, but I knew that like that guy, was him in that when it was 67, 68 Super Bowl. I thought that was like the most important thing that ever happened in football was when the Jets beat I think it was the Colts in that Super Bowl, because it was always the AFC was always like the minor league or AFL at the time. It was like the minor league, and the NFL was the major league. And then when they won, it was just like, wow, it's like the whole balance of power changed. Because of the Raiders, I was a big AFL fan. And I believed like the Raiders and the Chiefs could beat any team in the NFL, but that was like a laughing stock of view. And when Namath won the Super Bowl and then the Chiefs won the next year over the Vikings, it was like, okay, they really were better. They were more. If you remember at that time, they were more progressive and more wide open.
Does it pain you at all that the Raiders are no longer in Oakland?
I mean, because it happened before, not as much. I think that it's a real. The first time they moved, I thought it was a real indictment of everything in sports, because it's one thing if you're a team and for whatever reason the local people don't want you, you're not over in the city, you don't draw well, and they move to a place that wants you more. I get that, okay? But Oakland Raiders were like an institution, and they always sold out, and then they left. I just thought that, like, this place supported them for all those years, would continue to support them. They were like that part of your city that the baseball teams never really were here as much. The 49ers really weren't. I mean, they had their fan base, but the Raiders were a different type of a fan base. And when they moved, the first time they moved, I thought it was really bad. After that, it's kind of like, well, that's the gig, you know. So this time, it didn't bother me as much. And I also, you know, with the one, you know, I mean, I knew this was coming for years from UFC, believe it or not, because it was like UFC people were just basically telling me before anyone even talked about it. It's like, look, you know, Lorenzo's going to build a football stadium because he can't be an owner because of they'll never let a casino guy be an owner, but he's going to sell the UFC, which he did like 2 years later. He's going to sell the UFC. He's going to get involved in the football stadium. They're going to bring the Raiders over, and that's what's going to happen. And, you know, years later, that's exactly how it played out.
Yeah, and it's crazy to think about, too, the late, great owner, Al Davis of the Raiders. I mean, yeah, he definitely alienated a lot of people, especially, you know, at the end. But, I mean, he was a guy that was brash, that was pretty revolutionary for his time, that took some major stands, that hired Amy Trask. I think she was like the first or one of the first major female executives in the NFL. I mean, I really feel like a lot of promoters today could learn a lot from prime Al Davis.
Al Davis reminds me a lot of Vince McMahon, a lot. You know, in the sense of when he was in his prime, he revolutionized everything. And Vince McMahon now is in the line Al Davis, which is really sad to watch. Having watched Al Davis, you know, at the end, and him not being Al Davis anymore, and just being out of touch. And that's, you know, I mean, people don't want to say it, but that really is Vince. He's you know, I mean, he needs to step down. He's an impediment now. And I hate to say it because you know, obviously I grew up with Vince McMahon. I covered Vince McMahon for, you know, almost 40 years. And Vince McMahon made wrestling really, really big. You can't take that away from him. I mean, you know, you can certainly question ethics, you know, greatly. But, you know, his mind and everything like that took wrestling to a great level. He made wrestling bigger than I ever dreamed it could be. But now, you know, he's a negative, unfortunately.
So on that note, just, I mean, being realistic with the stock market and everything else, and stockholders seeming to only really have confidence that a guy like Vince McMahon can run this company. Realistically speaking, do you see Paul Levesque ever actually running the company, or do you see them being sold to Amazon or Disney in a couple of years?
Yeah, I could see him being sold for sure, the way everything's going, but I don't see like Paul Levesque being CEO or COO. I could see him running creative. I mean, the thing with Paul, you know, and Paul's a really smart guy, and I think it would be better. I'm pretty sure it would be better if he was in charge right now. But he's still unproven, you know. But I mean, the thing that worries me about Paul a lot is on Wednesday, it's like he's got his show that he's in charge of has a real inability to draw people under the age of 50 very well, and that's not a good sign for going forward. And I wouldn't have expected it going in. You know, I thought when NXT got on TV that it was going to be, you know, real big fight for the younger audience, and it really hasn't been. You know, I mean, NXT's the oldest skewing, you know, wrestling show on television. Well, second oldest, actually. Impact's the oldest, but you know, NXT's the second oldest, and so that makes me kind of concerned about Paul Levesque going. It's like this is kind of like you know, you were kind of given this thing to learn and to do it and see what you could do, and you're handed something where you don't really have to make money on it. You know, you can just do what you want to do and put on the show that you want to put on and grab pretty much all the independent talent you want. Before AEW, you could get anyone you wanted. Now with AEW, it's a little harder. But he got great talent, but it's somehow not appealing to the younger fan base. Where when I thought they got on TV, I thought, no, they're gonna connect with the younger fan base, and they didn't. So that is my concern with Paul Levesque. But you know, I think he'll be the guy in charge of creative on the main roster. Hopefully sooner than later.
In addition to, of course, running Wrestling Observer, F4WOnline.com, you're also a parent. You're also a husband. You're an entrepreneur. How the hell do you balance everything every day? Not
very well, but I try really hard. You know, mean, I work really hard at what I can do at all facets, but it's very hard, that aspect. But, you know, I love my kids, though. And I got great kids. My son's awesome. You know, he really is never, you know, valedictorian of his class and never gets into trouble and, you know, pretty darn genius and, you know, a lot more grown up than I was when I was his age. That's for sure.
That's awesome. God bless him. That's great to hear, and, you know, definitely wish him and your family the best. So, Dave, we really do appreciate the time. Before we get you out of here, what's the best piece of advice you give anybody hoping to have success?
Work really hard is almost like the necessity. When you're young, listen and learn as much as you can from smart people and pay freaking attention to them. You don't have to listen to everything they say, but there's a lot. If you're with smart people and you figure out what they say works and doesn't, you're going to be way ahead of the game. But you got to listen. You got to listen. And, you know, if you don't listen and you don't want to learn, I mean, that to me, my key is that I never want to stop learning. Other people think they already know, and it's like, I don't know, and I know more than you, so you don't know either. You never fully, like wrestling, you never fully know wrestling. Nobody fully knows wrestling. The people who think they know wrestling, they're the ones that are going to be out of touch because it's always going to change. But yeah, just listen. I mean, from writing, read a lot of good writers. I mean, and learn from how they do it. I mean, I'll never be Frank Deford, but my God, I when I was a kid, I read, you know, Frank Deford and Scott Ostler and different guys like that, and even the stats guys. I was really into there were certain writers that were really good stats guys, and they fascinated me, and I learned the stats aspect as well as the flowing words aspect. So you got to learn both. You got to learn the business that you know, like if you're a sports writer and you don't know business, I think you're way behind. I mean, I know with MMA, a lot of the reporters, when I first started covering MMA, the MMA reporters were so far behind on the business end, and they've caught up. But when they started, it's like they just liked fighting. You know, it's like, you know, it's the fight business. If you don't know the business, you don't get the fighting. You don't get, you know, they would complain about UFC making matches, and I would sit there and go like, that's the right match to make. It's the match the fans want to see, and they would just be, but it's not, you know, number one and number two, and it's like the fans don't want number one and number two. They want personality. So, you know, and in time you figure that out. Yeah, just like listen, pay attention to what the fans want, and also understand that will always change, whether it's football or hockey or whatever. You know, what gets the fans going is going to be something new, not something old, and it's going to always change. But if you know that going in, and you see the trends starting somewhere early, look for the new trends. If you look for the new trends, you'll be ahead of the game. And it's better to be ahead than behind.
Well said. And how and one more. How cool is it? Right, you just mentioned before you grew up reading Frank Deford. Later, you worked for him, were mentored by him, learned from him. How cool is it these days, whether it be wrestlers, fans, whoever, to hear, Dave, I grew up reading you. I still read you to this day. I love your shows, all that jazz.
It's really cool. When we do the Q&As before the pandemic, we would go to like big shows like WrestleMania or you know, AEW shows or whatever, New Japan shows. I would see people who've been reading for like 30 years and 35 years. It's awesome. That was the most gratifying part of my job for sure, was meeting people at live shows. And that is actually among the, of all the things, one of the things that I miss the most is going to shows. The other thing about going to shows is that when you go to the right kind of shows and you watch the young wrestlers on the way up, you get to kind of see what's going to be working in 5 years too. So, unfortunately that doesn't exist right now. I can't wait for that to come back, but, obviously we gotta get a vaccine because that's really going to be the only answer. But we've got to get rid of this disease because we're all going to be crippled until that happens, unfortunately, and it's a very trying period. I think it's like in many ways it's the worst period in the history of our lives. I mean, some people's lives are better. I mean, in the sense, economically, some people are good and some people are bad and all that. But as far as like overall, I adapting, especially now with school about to start and the mess of you know, if we send kids to school right now, it's going to be a complete disaster, unfortunately. And but you want your kids to learn at the same time, so it's like we're in a really trying period.
Hey, as the old saying goes, it's cool to read about history. It sometimes sucks to live through it, but you know, the one thing is from that standpoint. Right now sucks, but in 3 years, having lived through this, we're all gonna grown up a ton, and we're gonna be a lot smarter for it. Not everyone, but many of us are gonna be, because we were forced to adapt and learn, and you know, that because you're forced into understanding what you like and what you don't like, and when you can't do it, you learn to miss it and you appreciate it more. So there's a lot of positives that could come from this period, but they're not happening now. They're going to happen in like 3 years when we look back. You know, economically, like, there's smarter ways to do what we used to be doing. But you know, living through it is a very difficult period. It is, but hey, you know, from a day-to-day perspective, right? I'm sure you can attest to this. As long as you wake up, as long as you have your health, I mean, look, anything's possible as long as you can, you know, say you're healthy, because unfortunately, not everybody can say that right now.
Health is absolutely 100% the most important thing. 100%. I mean, be blessed that you have your health, because if you don't, you know, that's the health is definitely the most important thing for sure.
For sure. Awesome, Dave. Well, thank you so much, man. As a subscriber since May 2011, it was an absolute honor to talk to you, to talk about your career, to learn, you know, a lot about you in this interview. Fans, you can check out Dave Meltzer's work at WrestlingObserver.com, F4WOnline.com. You can follow him on Twitter at Dave Meltzer, WON. Dave, anywhere else?
Nope, that's pretty much it.
Awesome. Dave, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Okay, very welcome.